Hi, this is Jennifer Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. You may not have heard too much about it, but it just might be the most important election of 2024. Now, I don't mean Donald Trump. I mean the election for the state Supreme Court of North Carolina. That was a race that was razor close. The winner won by about 700 votes or so. That person was the Democrat who is joining us now, Allison Riggs. However, the opposition was not willing to concede. And what has played out over weeks and months is the most astounding effort I've ever seen to overturn a completely legitimate, valid election result. And here to tell us all about it is the justice herself. What was the problem that the courts perceived and that your opponent was attempting to show with the ballots that were cast? What did these people do wrong, or what did somebody else do wrong?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. It's a real honor
Sure.
to chat with you. After a close election loss, 734 votes, but that margin being confirmed by two independent recounts, my opponent kind of threw spaghetti at the wall and picked a few different categories of votes that he wanted to challenge and say those were votes that shouldn't be counted. And he hoped to win after, and I kid you not, subtracting those votes from the vote count in the North Carolina Supreme Court race only. So, like, alleging that these votes were improperly cast, but they were fine for electing Donald Trump, and fine in every other statewide race. Mine is the only one affected. If your listeners are wondering how that makes sense, it doesn't. But he was targeting the biggest buckets are voters who allegedly have incomplete voter registrations, missing data. And for a long time, our voter registration form didn't mandate provision of a social security number or a driver's license number. The form didn't. So the voters did everything right. And my parents are both challenged. So my parents are at risk of having their ballots tossed. They retired to North Carolina to be near their daughters and their grandkids. Um, my parents, my dad's 30-year Navy retired. They both have military IDs. They went to register in person to vote with their military IDs. Military IDs don't have driver's license numbers on them, obviously, or social security numbers. The federal Help America Vote Act says you can't disenfranchise people who lack that information if they bring some ID with them. We have a voter ID law in North Carolina. My parents bring picture ID every time they vote. They've never had any issue with voting. And so that's a big chunk of the over 68,000 people he's trying to toss. That's about 60,000 of them. It also turns out he's just wrong about at least half of them. They did provide that data, and either it was handwriting or systems that haven't been revamped because the legislature won't fund updated software. Whatever. These voters did nothing wrong. They did everything that was asked of them. The other category are military and overseas voters, military who are active duty and deployed, stationed at a base away from North Carolina, so away from their home, or serving overseas at a foreign base, serving on the front lines of battlefields or, in covert situations, missionaries living abroad. These are people who have historically had a hard time voting because of their circumstances. And it's meant to also support military families, just so you know. Military families, if their family's stationed in Italy, the whole family gets to use this, it's called UOCAVA ballots. They're federal ballots. None of these federal ballot voters are required to show a picture ID when they vote because they go through a separate process of requesting this federal ballot. The North Carolina State Board, no state requires UOCAVA ballots to do that. Doesn't matter what their underlying ID laws are. But these voters were told explicitly that they didn't have to provide it. They relied on the instructions provided to them. And this isn't this issue's become politicized. Election administration has sadly become politicized. This was a rule that was promulgated through a process where both political parties were heard, were given a chance to comment on rules. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't done in dark. It's even-handed. And my opponent is challenging not all of the 32,000 overseas military or deployed military voters. He is only challenging them in 4 of the most Democratic counties in the state. So you might, again, your listeners might be thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. Why does a voter in Durham who did the exact same thing as a voter in Jacksonville get disenfranchised? It doesn't make any sense. But the Court of Appeals, our intermediate appellate court on Friday, for the first time in history, rubber stamped or gave a nod of approval to this idea that you can change the rules of an election after an election already happened and decide to selectively narrow what votes count when voters have done nothing wrong, when everyone's followed all of the rules. And, I think the real threat, there's a couple of different real threats. One is that the people in power, whoever it is, wherever it is, whatever their political affiliation, people in power should not be able to choose whether or not to acknowledge an election result based on if they like who won. It's just antithetical with our basic concepts of democracy and fairness. Secondly, I mean, this is a judicial race, and we are in this moment where we're fighting against a more political judiciary where the judiciary is under threats, and we need an independent judiciary willing to enforce checks and balances, who will not bow to political pressure. It's the federal system, but it's the state system too. And so this is a very scary path that we are heading down. And it's why, I was a civil rights attorney before I joined the bench. I fought gerrymandering and voter suppression, and I did it in a nonpartisan way. I didn't care who did it, because the right to vote is fundamental, and people in our history have fought, bled, and died for it. And I believe in accountability. And accountability means that voters get to decide elections, not courts, not politicians. And we go into an election with a set of rules, and those are the rules that apply for that election. So this is a big fight. It's one with national implications, and I'm so glad to be able to share this with you.
Now, since that ruling, the state Supreme Court has come in and stayed that ruling. What happens now? Will there
So,
be full briefing? Will there be full argument at the Supreme Court?
so the long and short of it is I'm not fully sure. They stayed the Court of Appeals ruling. We went over the weekend and asked for an emergency stay so that the State Board of Elections and voters weren't trying to cure registrations that had nothing wrong with it, and
Right.
mass chaos ensues. Right now, pending in front of the Supreme Court is what's called a petition for discretionary review. So the North Carolina Supreme Court technically still has to decide whether it's going to take the case or not. If they don't take the case, it leaves the Court of Appeals opinion standing. If they do take the case, then presumably the normal course is briefing and oral argument. I've said all along that I think this matter needs to be resolved in federal courts, because the relief that my opponent seeks violates federal laws.
Right.
The federal courts have said, yes, we do have jurisdiction over this, and we will take it up, but we'll let the state court process play out first. And so we've still got a long fight ahead of us in this drama.
Right.
I'm in this for the long haul. I know how important this is. My poor husband thought election day ended 5 months ago. I'm a first-time political candidate, so this was all a learning curve for us, but
Wow.
we know that this is a fight worth having.
Now, to be clear, when they say an opportunity to cure, they mean that tens of thousands of people in these very Democratic districts. They may not have transportation. They may not know that this is going on, have a very short time to physically come back in, show their IDs, and show exactly what information should have been collected but wasn't by the state. And they have a relatively short period of time to do this.
Right. So per the Court of Appeals ruling, when and if it goes into effect, it would be 15 days. You have these voters who have some alleged issue with their registration, which is separate and apart from these military and overseas voters who need to provide a copy of an ID. So like it's going to be very confusing for your average voter who doesn't understand the difference between those buckets. And, it's hard to explain. I mean, election administration, especially in decentralized systems, which is what we have across this country. I mean, we have
Yes.
100 counties in North Carolina. Each of them essentially runs its own election administration system. There's a sort of quasi-federated state board of elections, but a voter in one county in eastern North Carolina might have a different understanding and experience than a voter in western North Carolina. The counties have different resources to advertise. You can imagine within 15 days, if you're a submariner, my dad was a Navy man, so if you're a submariner, best of luck if you're able to know about this and act in time. Same thing with missionaries out on the field. I mean, it's a very short amount of time. It presumes that folks, one, didn't vote and just sort of move on to the next thing. And in truth, we want voters to walk out of a polling place with the confidence that their
Yes.
vote will count if they followed all of the rules. It isn't good or healthy for our democracy or faith in our electoral system for voters now to say, well, wait a second, I did everything I was supposed to do. And, voters who care, there's varying levels of engagement, but for voters who are very nervous and care a lot, we're seeing the system being taxed with people calling our elections board saying, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And
Right.
the elections board, who may have one or two full-time staff, is getting inundated. And it's just unnecessary. Every day that this stretches on, it's harmful to the trust that people will place in our electoral system. It breeds a kind of misinformation and distrust of the system that allows things like January 6th to happen. And
Right.
so, for people like me who come from a background of wanting to protect robustly important civil rights, but also make sure that we have
Right.
nonpartisan, orderly election administration, because that's how we safeguard the right to vote. It's a very sad turn of events, and it's why I'm fighting so hard. Because, and my opponent is a sitting judge too. I put my hand on a Bible and swore an oath to defend and uphold our state and federal constitutions. People ought to be able to expect and demand from their judicial officials a commitment to upholding the rule of law, even above political ambition. So I talk to voters all the time in these 68,000 voters who didn't vote for me. And I am fighting tooth and nail in a court every day to make sure their vote counts, because that's what they deserve of a leader. And so
Right.
this is an opportunity in a state that is very purple, is very divided, for us to show what it means to lead with character, to serve in a nonpartisan, non-political way, and to demand that every eligible vote counts.
Last question for you as we reach the end of our time. It's somewhat shocking, even to me, having read about this case, that we're talking about a sitting judge who is, as you say, throwing the spaghetti against the wall, seeking to disenfranchise people who cast legal ballots. Has he given an explanation or defended himself in this behavior, which seems to violate most judicial precepts? It's one thing for a political candidate, as disagreeable as this may be, who simply wants to win at all costs, but he is a judge after all. Has he commented on this?
Yeah, I can't speak to his motivations. And, there's an ongoing sort of dispute about judges speaking generally about this. To be clear, I am recused in this case, as I
Yes,
should be. I should not be deciding my own election outcome. My parents are directly affected by this. Like, I have an obvious conflict. I wouldn't be talking about this case if I were sitting on the case.
yes,
And that's right. But I think it's important that people know what's happening, that democracy cannot die in darkness, and that it will die if this is done in darkness, and that I have a constitutional obligation that
yes,
supersedes all else to make sure that we are protecting our Constitution and our rule of law. And that's why I fight so hard. That's why I talk about what it means to have fair courts that stand up for people and put people over politics, and that this needs to end, that this is
yes.
hurting everyone, and we can bring this to an end quickly.
Well, we will continue to follow the race. It is rather shocking to all of us, the way this has been cherry picked. And if the state Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom doesn't figure this out, we certainly hope that the federal courts stand on principle. And after all, we're talking about, among other things, disenfranchising people who are serving overseas and putting their lives on the line. So thanks so much for joining us, Justice Riggs. We'll continue to follow the story.
Thank you so much for having me.